There's a brief story I want to share with you, and this does have a bit to do with the sermon. And actually, the story I heard comes from the TV show The West Wing, when it was on air. And at one point, a Catholic priest is advising the president, because the president is Catholic in this, of course, but advising him on a particular matter. And the president is indecisive of what he should do. Should he stick to his faith, or should he do what is politically expedient? And the Catholic priest tells him this story. There is a valley, and in this valley is a river. And next to the river lives an old man, and he has lived there most of his life. And they get word from the meteorologist that a record-breaking flood is coming and going to go through this valley, and it's going to wash away everything in the valley. But they're not going to stand idly by and let this happen. So the first thing they do is they send out a radio broadcast warning every resident of this valley that they need to leave this very day, no, this very instant. Otherwise, they are going to be swept away. And this old man, he hears this radio broadcast, and he thinks to himself, you know, I have worshiped God all my life. He loves me, and he is going to save me. And he ignores the radio broadcast. As the morning goes on, the rains start to fall, and looking out at his river, the water is starting to come up higher and higher on the bank. Fearing that people didn't listen, they send a police car out to go down the road to warn the residents. And this police officer pounds on this man's door and warns him about the rising floodwaters and how his house and everything he has is going to be swept away if he does not flee now. And the man says to the police officer, I have served God all my life. He loves me and he will save me, and sends the police officer away. It gets on into the afternoon. The water is starting to finally crest over the banks and start to come up near the edge of his house. And just then, as he's watching the water come up near his house, here comes a boat coming down the river, and it sees the old man in his house, and it stops. And from the boat, the pilot of the boat calls out to him, don't you see the water rising? Everything you have is going to be swept away. Come on my boat, and I will take you to safety this very instant. But the old man once again admonishes the boat driver and tells him, I have served God all my life. He loves me, and he will save me, and sends him on his way. Well, as nightfall comes, and the waters keep rising as the rains come in, and this old man has now had to climb up onto the roof of his house, and there he's shivering in the rain. But here comes along a helicopter, and the searchlight hits him, and they see him. They lower a basket down, and they plead with him, sir, please get in the basket. The floodwaters are going to keep rising, and you and everything you have is about to be swept away. But the old man once again shoved off the basket, shook his fist at the helicopter, and yells at them, I have served God all my life. He loves me, and I know he will save me. Without much to do, the helicopter once again moves off. And overnight, as the meteorologist predicted, the floodwaters do indeed rise further, and everything in the valley is swept away by the floodwater. Now this man, he's in heaven. And the first thing he does is he storms in, and he comes up to God and basically pounds on the floor before his throne and demands of God, I have served you faithfully all my life. I know that you love me. Why did you not save me? And God just looks down at him and with a sigh, just shakes his head and tells him, I gave you a radio message, a police officer, a boat, and a helicopter. What more do you want from me? That man, much like Jonah, and much like many people in the world, have a misconception or do not understand the character of God. In his mind, his actions deserve a divine miracle, to be saved by God. Now, some people think this way. But the main question that we're going to be looking at today, and one that I have been looking at throughout the book of Jonah, and one that I'm finding surprising as I'm really diving into this, to study this book as I never had before. If you remember those 4 goals or 4 understandings that I introduced last week that we're going to see throughout this book. That by the end of it, we'll have a better understanding of the character of God. That by the end of our study, because of our understanding of the character of God, we will have a better understanding of his message. And that once we understand his character and his message, that are we willing to be used by him? And by willing to be used by him, can we rejoice when those who have wronged us in the past repent and come to know him as their personal Lord and Savior? Those are the four goals, or four better understandings that I want us to have at the end of this book. And today we're going to be looking primarily at that first, to understand better the character of God. Because in our world today, why do so many people reject God? Now, largely we can think of them falling into one of two camps, although ultimately it's one camp. The first are people who just refuse to believe that divine beings can exist, or if they cannot quantitatively explain through science and break it down into experiment to show how exactly something works, that they refuse to believe it. Now, our God falls into that in many ways because he has powers and abilities beyond our ability to measure or even understand fully. But there's the group of people that they refuse to believe in God simply because he cannot be defined in human terms. Then there are those who misunderstand God, or they reject him, or the biblical view of him, because they misunderstand his character. Now, what is character? I'm not going to use the Webster definition of character. We're going to be looking at character just briefly. And character largely falls under three different attributes. First, we have physical attributes. If we were to describe someone to someone else, if I want to describe to you someone out of a crowd, I might start with the physical attributes because that would be the quickest. Now, God can choose his own physical attributes. We see that he has taken on human form with his son. But trying to describe, is he tall? Is he whatever ethnicity? We can't really do that. But physical attributes, at least when it comes to people, are the things we don't have control over, although God has control over it. But what he is, he has omnipotent power, knows all, and has always existed. These are the physical characteristics that define who God is. From that, we can also, not from that, but in addition to what defines someone's character, are their values, the logic of their actions, the morals by which they live out their life, and their outlook upon life. And then there's their actions. Are they congruent with their morals? Are they demonstrations of their values? Really, are their actions really reveal what those values are? And these are an easy definition by which we can define something's character. Now we could get into a character study on God, defining these, but let's look at some of the common misconceptions that we see, because Jonah has some of these when we see his actions last week when he fled from God. Now, one of the most popular views of God, both outside of Christianity and even some groups within it, is God is the divine Santa. And much like Santa, he has a list of who is naughty and who is nice. And at some undisclosed time, you are going to get whatever the list says you dictate. And by and large, we don't get to know the contents or by the metric by which you end up on this list. And many groups within Christianity, or claim to be within Christianity, this is their view on God. You can't know you're guaranteed going to heaven. You need to do these works in hope that you end up on the nice list, so at the appointed hour, in our case, not Christmas morning, but at the end of your life, that you have done enough to earn your place onto the nice list. and not the nihilist. Some have the misconception that God really is just a really, really powerful human, or that he thinks exactly like us. He has the same morals as us, and the same understanding of how the world works as us. So, is it really hard to fault them sometimes when they wonder why there is evil in the world? Because they think God operates by the exact same morals as we do, by the exact same judgment as we do. That's one easy way that they think of God. Then there's two views that are both two separate parts of the same, or two opposite sides of the same coin. That God is either a nebulous force for good, that all religions are talking about the exact same God, that Jesus, Buddha, Allah are really all different good paths towards God, that they're all talking about the same thing, they would claim. Or, on the flip side, that God is some unrelatable force of vengeance. That much like the God, they would say of the Old Testament, he's just waiting for people to screw up because he really loves smiting things. These are some of the misconceptions of God in our day, and they largely come about because people don't know the character of God. Much in the same way, Jonah runs because he is misunderstanding the character of who God is. He thinks that once I get beyond the border of the nation of Israel and the nation of Judah, that I'm home free, that I don't have to carry out this crazy suicidal denouncing of the most evil empire on earth, and I'm scot-free. One misconception that Jonah is probably thinking about. And he thinks that once I'm beyond that, what can God do? I'm beyond his ability. But the misconception, the big one that Jonah has, is that God is not just going to let people run away from him if he's chosen them. God is going to actively pursue Jonah. He is being pursued by God. Or also the extreme lengths that God will go to save his chosen. Now, last time we read the first 3 verses. Today, in a similar manner, we're going to read the next 3 verses. And here we have, continuing on, in Jonah 1, Jonah 1, verse 4. But the Lord sent out a great wind on the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship was about to be broken up. Now, we talked briefly. Jonah had some misconceptions. That if he went to Nineveh, he was going to die. That he was going to be tortured. And if he was very lucky, those events would happen in that exact order. That Jonah had the misconception that if he went and delivered such a message, that he could not be protected by God. So he fled. And if we were to skip ahead to the end of Jonah in chapter 4, we also see that Jonah did not want the nation of Nineveh to be forgiven. But he runs because he's running under the misconception that God is somehow locked within the nations of Israel. This is the large worldview of people and their relationship with the ancient gods of the ancient world. That once I get outside this nation, that God really has no ability to affect what I do. But God is going to demonstrate that he is not like those other gods, locked by boundaries. And he is not like those other gods who largely don't care what you do. He is a God who pursues you. He is a God who wants a relationship with you. And God does this in verse 4 by orchestrating this storm. In fact, this great storm that threatens to break this ship up. And he's letting Jonah know, and us know from the events taking course, that he is not merely a one-trick God. That what happens, that he has more control than just what happens in Israel. That he's not like the other gods who are delegated to certain dominions of control, where Baal would be the god of rain, fertility, and life, God is not the God of just three minor aspects of life. He is a God in complete control of everything. And we could see this if we were to examine all the plagues of Egypt. Now, this is a great example of which, that we're not going to go through each plague line by line, but each plague was an attack on a very specific Egyptian god. Egypt had many gods, and each of them had their own little domain that they managed over. And God was able to confound the power of their gods and demonstrate how he was superior. And some of these ones, especially when it got near the end, where the chief magicians of the Egyptians were not able to replicate these plagues, that God was able to show off his extreme power, especially when you look at the second to last plague, where God sent darkness across the land of Egypt, except for the land of Goshen, where the people of Israel were being held. That was an attack against the chief god of the Egyptian religion, Ra, who was the god of the sun, the leader of their pantheon. And Ra would may be able to, in their mindset, be able to control the day and the night. But making the entire land of Egypt dark, except for where our enemies are now located, I doubt they've ever had an account of Ra doing a similar thing. But here, the God of the Israelites, of the people who are being enslaved by us, can somehow show up our chief deity. And the plague that followed, the death of the firstborn of all of those in the land of Egypt who did not mark their doorposts with the blood of the Lamb. Now that's a very targeted plague that none of the other gods of Egypt could have carried out, or any other god of the ancient world that I know of. God was able to show that he is not bound by the rules of the other gods. And by this demonstration, God shows that he can carry out his word. That when he tells Jonah to go to the land of Nineveh, to cry out against it, he is now demonstrating here by orchestrating the storm that he can act beyond the borders by which men thought that the gods operated in. That he can operate outside of the dominion given to other gods. That he's not bound to some control of just an ocean, or just the weather, or just crops, or just life. He is the God of creation, the God who has dominion over all things. He is demonstrating now that by sending this storm, that yes, Jonah, I can raise the nation of Assyria to the ground, if that is required. I can protect you, if that is required. And I can certainly send this storm to let you know that I am God. And now moving on to verse 5. We see an account here that Jonah writes, "Then the mariners were afraid, and every man cried out to his God, and threw the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten the load. But Jonah had gone down into the lowest part of the ship, had laid down, and was fast asleep." Now here we are told of how severe the storm was. Before in verse 4 we saw that the storm was so severe it threatened to break up the ship, threatened to lose it. But now we're seeing the response of experienced sailors. Now I've only had a limited experience on a naval vessel, and the worst weather I've had was a slightly breezy day on a naval ship, slightly off the coast of Virginia. But you can feel the waves going. But the people there described are not just part-time sailors or brand new to the job. We know that from the destination they come from and the destination they're going to. This is as if traveling from one end of the world to the other. This is a very dangerous trek for them across the Mediterranean Sea, which can have very stormy weather. And Jonah wants us to know that this storm was so severe that these sailors, they were terrified. And the first thing they do when they're faced with such terror was what Jonah should have done in the first place. but they cry out to their gods. Jonah did not cry out to his God. He fled from his God. They cry out to, but these sailors, when faced with overwhelming fear, first they cry out to their gods. And then they abandon the cargo and start tossing it overboard to lighten the load to save them. Now, this is not an action that we should take lightly of these sailors, for they're hardy men to be able to take this journey to Tarshish and back. And abandoning their cargo is much more than just throwing the items overboard. First, we can think of that they would have the loss of profit from this particular journey. That by throwing it overboard, obviously they're not going to get paid for bringing their cargo. There's also the loss of reputation. No one wants to hire the sailors who, when they see a storm, throw your cargo into the sea. You're not going to get that money back. By being unreliable sailors, there's also the loss of employment. That they know that they'll be known as sailors who flee in the face of danger because they cannot prove the severity of the storm to outsiders. You have to go on their word that it was so bad they had to abandon the cargo, versus me thinking that the sailors were just lazy. And then for the captain, because certain things exist throughout time, such as taxes, so did insurance. Likely his ship was put up as collateral to even fund such a mission, because it's not just the cargo sailing. You need to also have the food. You need to pay the men sometimes a little bit in advance to get them to join up with you. And you need to have something by which to secure a loan. Now, that ship likely was put up as collateral. We don't know this in this case. But abandoning their cargo for the sailors likely meant that they were about to lose their entire livelihood. The captain was likely to lose his ship and his livelihood. And to just let us know the severity of the storm. That while the sailors saw something that gave them overwhelming fear, that they cried out to their gods, then abandoned their livelihood. Jonah, when faced with overwhelming fear of going to Nineveh, abandoned his livelihood to try to flee from God. Stark contrast between the two. And then in verse 6, we have an unlikely source of revelation about the character of God. And there it is recorded. So the captain came to him and said to him, "What do you mean, sleeper?" Because remember, Jonah is in the bottom of the ship, asleep. "What do you mean, sleeper? Arise, call on your God. Perhaps your God will consider us, so that we may not perish." For whatever reason, Jonah is able to sleep at the bottom of this boat in a storm so severe it's threatening to break up the ship. It terrifies some of the most experienced sailors of their day. And they're abandoning their cargo, and Jonah is asleep through it all. Now, it may be legitimate fatigue. Jonah just ran over 50 miles to get to Joppa, or maybe it was a bit longer, but quite a distance in their time to go to the one port to flee from his responsibility. It may also be ignorance. Joppa is the only port of the ancient world in Israel, and it's not controlled by Israel. It was controlled by the Phoenicians, who sometimes were or were not enemies of Israel and Judah. But for whatever reason, Jonah is oblivious to what is happening all around him. And then, amidst all of it, this unknown sea captain reveals to us already some about the nature and the character of God, where he tells Jonah, after admonishing him and telling him, wondering how he can even be asleep during all this, call on your God. And then there is this perhaps he can save us. Psalms 107, which we'll see from Jonah chapter 2, that Jonah likely knows the Psalms very well. In Psalms 107, verses 28 through 29, tells us this: "Then they will cry out to the Lord in their trouble, and he will bring them out of their distresses. He calms the storm so that its waves are still. But the Psalms tell us that by his character, God will sometimes listen when we cry out to him. That he is the God who not only can send the storm as Jonah is experiencing now, but the God who can calm the storm. And that he is a God who listens. And the sea captain, not knowing what kind of person Jonah is and where he comes from, as we'll see later on in our further study, when they ask Jonah where he comes from, and knows nothing about Jonah's God, somehow manages to hit the nail on the head of who Jonah's God is, with that one comment: perhaps your God will consider us, so that we may not perish. That is going to parallel largely what Jonah is going to eventually say in Jonah 4, when he tells God, I know that you are a just and merciful God. Yeah, God. Or he specifically says, I know that you are a gracious and merciful God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, one who relents from doing harm. Already, Jonah knows the character of God. That's why he said there he fled. But right away, we're getting some foreshadowing from this unknown sea captain about the character of God and how it's consistently presented here. That he is a God who wants to forgive those who repent. He's not like the other gods who are lazy and need to be reminded of their work and are largely bought and need to be appeased before they do their divine work of the domain that they have been appointed over. No, he is a God that already we're seeing has pursued Jonah. And now is waiting for Jonah to cry out to him. In the application of this text, we can realize that most of our current circumstances largely come about because of our misconception about God. That our relationship, that when we see it going badly, we need to self-examine. Is it because we misinterpreted or we don't fully understand who God is? And Jonah certainly knows many facts about God. And like at the end of the book, when he reveals the true reason why he did not want to go, he knew that fact about God, but he didn't believe it. That is why he fled, because he believed misconceptions about the character of who God says he is and what he is able to do. For us, what ministries has God called us for? And what excuses have we invented for ourselves not to carry them out? Is it because it's inconvenient? Or is it because we doubt that he is a God who is able to protect us, who is able to send us? If he's the God who can send a storm, surely he is able to do so. Is he a God that once I divorce him from that aspect of my life, that he will not pursue? From here we see that he goes extreme lengths to pursue Jonah. Is he like those other misconceptions about who people say God is? Is he really that divine Santa? Or is he just some unrelenting force of vengeance waiting to smite us that is completely unrelatable? By the sea captain's own words, and by what we'll see continually presented throughout the book of Jonah, he is a God who is quick to mercy, slow to anger, and ready to forgive the repentant. He is a God who loves us dearly, and a God who wants us to know more about his character. I have enjoyed studying the book of Jonah thus far and seeing this aspect throughout the book of Jonah. But when you spend time in the Word, and I encourage you all to spend time in the Word daily, you will see that this character of God is not just isolated to the book of Jonah, not just isolated to the New Testament, as some people like to put it, that the God of the Old Testament was some vengeful, smiting God, and then he had a son and mellowed out. But he is a God whose character is consistent throughout the entire Bible. And he is pursuing you just as he is pursuing Jonah. Amen?
Amen.